Hello, everyone. My name is Cherise Francis, and welcome to the second workshop of Teks, Reconstruction, a speculative, a speculative revisioning of America. Just to give you a little information, Teks is a monthly workshop series where I look at poetry and poetics from an interdisciplinary approach. So today we'll be looking at three different poets: Candace Williams, Tracy K. Smith, and Sasha Banks. Before we get started, I wanted to say that this workshop was made possible partially in thanks to Queen's Council on the Arts New Works Grant. So if there is anybody joining with me live today, please do say hello in the chat. So let's begin. Okay. So again, the workshop is Reconstruction, a Speculative Revisioning of America. Oops. So in terms of Reconstruction, one question that I have is, what is America and what is un-America? There's a segment of our population that likes to think that the horrors that we see happen here is un-American, that it doesn't reflect the ideals on which this country is built on. But if you come from a marginalized background, or if you're aware of the history of this country, you know that America was built on violence and erasure of marginalized people, of people that weren't considered white, male, heterosexual, Christian, right? And so part of Reconstruction of America is facing the truth of what America is. And thinking about Reconstruction, I thought of the actual historical moment of Reconstruction after the Civil War. This was an era of time. This was an era of time where there was a lot of political possibility. From the chaos of the Civil War, people were allowed to reimagine what was possible for America. It was during these times that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, I believe, were instituted, and that gave certain freedoms to formerly enslaved Black people. And it also, the Reconstruction allowed for formerly enslaved Black people to enter the political arena in ways that they weren't able to before. And so looking at Reconstruction and looking at our current times in the midst of social unrest, I think it would be important to look at a reconstruction, thinking of possible ways that we can bring in marginalized voices into the larger political framework of America, and maybe create a new America, or maybe even call it something else. So one thing I wanted to highlight, hi Valerie. One thing I wanted to highlight was the musical Hamilton. And I know that's a very popular musical right now. I remember seeing it online with my friend a few years ago. I'm not going to tell you how. But yeah, I feel very conflicted about the musical in of itself. Uh, I enjoy the music. I love Leslie Odom Jr. And it's a well-crafted musical, like a lot of people agree. But there's also the other side that I also agree with in terms of being critical about representation, right? Like which stories get chosen to be told and which stories don't get chosen to be told. Is it enough to take a story about the forefathers of this country who were known to be either slave owners or benefit financially off of slavery and the entire system of slavery, to then change the face of that story to include marginalized faces, black and brown people, right? And so I've been thinking a lot about superficial representation and superficial mythologies and how Hamilton can fall in line with a lot of other harmful mythologies that are brought out as popular works in this country. For example, the myth around Christopher Columbus, sailed the ocean blue in 1492, that became popularized because of Washington Irving, who was known for, I think it was Spooky Hollow. He wrote a book on the life and voyages of Christopher Columbus. And it was through that book that popularized this mythology that Christopher Columbus discovered America. And then if we think of more recent works like Pocahontas, which again, I like Disney musicals, but you realize that a lot of Disney musicals try to sanitize history, right? And that includes Pocahontas, which literally was a story about a young Native American girl who was kidnapped and raped from her community. But then Disney takes that story and tries to romanticize it, and in essence erases that difficult, problematic, troubling history. And Hamilton could, in a sense, be seen in the same way. And I can see why certain artists like Toni Morrison and Ishmael Reed had a huge problem with it because of that. So, in thinking of a different kind of historical revision, I wanted to focus on works that look at erasure and contrapuntal forms as tools that can create a more equal playing ground to include marginalized voices and their histories in works. So 2 examples I have here are from M. Norbice Phillips' Zong and Olio by Tahimba Jess. But first, I also wanted to talk about anthems. So anthems are often seen as patriotic songs. But if we look up the etymology of the word anthem, we get antiphony. And basically, it was a form of choral singing in which one person would speak and another person would respond. So I want us to think of anthems in a new way, in essence, allowing people to speak across different groups so they can get a better understanding of each other. And I see that in the forms of erasure and contrapuntal forms of poetry. So with Zong, M. Norbice Philip basically took the story of a slave ship called Zong, in which 150 Africans were thrown overboard so that the slave traders could collect insurance money. And so she took a legal document that was about the court case in which they received money for the loss of life, basically loss of property. They weren't even considered living beings. And so she took that legal document and created an erasure poem with that. And that's the first piece that you see down there. And then the other piece is from Olio by Time Jess. And it's a contrapuntal poem in which he has Eliza Bethune, who was the wife of the slave owner of Tom Wiggins, who was a piano prodigy and also blind. And he was basically paraded around as this prodigy, and Eliza Bethune benefited financially off of him. And Charity Wiggins is Tom's actual biological mother. And so in this poem, he has both Eliza, Tamba Jess has both Eliza and Charity speak, and you can see the two sides speaking across to each other. And so the contrapuntal creates this kind of equal playing field where everyone's voice gets to be heard. And through that, you get a larger picture of the conversation, you get the larger picture of America, essentially. And so next. So first, we have an erasure piece from Candace Williams called The Panther Gets Loose. And this was based off of a newspaper article called The Panther Escapes from the Bronx Zoo. And what's interesting about this piece is obviously she's making a reference to the actual Black Panthers through this article. So let's actually read it. Okay. 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 So Panther gets loose. Gnaws his way from cage, keepers with net, ropes, and chain, spread terror in the neighborhood for miles around, a hunting party, platoons of police from 3 police stations, doing whatever mischief. The panther is a young male, is a fine specimen of the tribe. Being 18, folks could hardly believe an animal could be so active. The handsome, brownish fellow had an immense desire for freedom at times, had never made any wild breaks, had seen captivity all its days. There had been no thought of the panther's teeth in the building of the prison. Shouts of laughter, joking, merriment, and carelessness suddenly change into fear and dread when the panther liberated himself. Okay. So, as you can see from this poem, Candace highlights the connection between animals in captivity in zoos with racialized captivity, right? that freedom that freedom for humanity has to do with who we consider human, right? And that people who are not beings who are not considered human are often caged and policed and are seen as threats and dangers. And she uses the Erasure poem to highlight that. Now, the original piece, which I don't have access to, probably sides with the people who are in power who are trying to get the panther back in the cage. But through the Erasure poem, she highlights the agency of the panther and its willingness to try to liberate itself. So in the next poem from Candace, we have Explore. Explorer is also based off of a newspaper article called Explorer Werner Home with African Curios. Brings Mr. Otabenga, a dwarf, to act as his valet. Okay. Stop sharing the screen so I can switch over to the other screen. Okay. So Explorer brings to America things he has taken. No, brings to America all things he has taken. He worked with great speed, tying strings. His haste was due to his desire. He is most expert in the ability to make snares, one of the necessary accomplishments of his people. His nimble fingers make a net. With great rapidity, these nets are stretched great distances and drive prey into the snares, where they become entangled. His favorite playground is Africa. So many deities convenient for his veneration. Clad in a khaki jacket, he grins good-naturedly and says yes to all questions. One of the few words he knows. He has seen so many things, he is beyond feeling. White man began in a ship, silent, the whites of his silent, showing the whites of his eyes and teeth. So this piece, Explore, is also connected to the last piece in the sense of Otabenga was an African man who was brought over to America and basically shown in human zoos. So again, the idea of gets to be considered human and who is not considered human, and when someone is not considered human, they are made into a spectacle. And so this piece is basically an answering back to that spectacle making, basically the spectacle speaking back and seeing that the explorer is a threat, is not necessarily an enlightened person, but someone who is coming to ensnare and is coming to take this person away from their home, is basically this kind of sly trickster who is endangering people in Africa. So it's turning around the idea of the explorer as this harmless being and more of a threat. Yeah. So back to okay. So that's Candace Williams. Next piece that we have is from Tracy K. Smith, and this is an erasure piece of the Declaration of Independence. And when it comes to kind of similar to Zong from M. Norbees Phillips, we need to think about when it comes to documents and stories and myths, who wrote it and what was it written for and who it was written for and who is not included. Something that is obscured in the Declaration of Independence. Oftentimes, a lot of people use the Declaration as this kind of ideal document and don't deconstruct it and its history and who wrote it and who it was written for, and whether it's really an all-inclusive document. So this is her poem, which I will read. He has sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people. He has plundered our, ravaged our, destroyed the lives of our, taking away our, abolishing our most valuable, and altering fundamentally the forms of our in every stage of these oppressions we have petitioned for. Redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here, taken captive on the high seas to bear. So in this poem, you see how Tracy took a portion of the Declaration in which I believe Thomas Jefferson was speaking about the British, in a sense, terrorizing the Americans and wanting independence from them because of it. And she through the Erasure poem, reveals the hypocrisy of the text in relation to Native Americans, enslaved people, that the same terror that is done to Americans, they enact on marginalized folks. Yeah. And let's also watch a video in which she's reading.
So this is one of
First, let me switch over.
the poems that's really kind of thinking about history. And it is written by taking the Declaration of Independence and deleting most of it. And what I heard in what remained, or what remains, seemed really uncanny and poignant. Declaration. He has sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people. He has plundered our, ravaged our, destroyed the lives of our, taking away our, abolishing our most valuable and altering fundamentally the forms of in every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here, taken captive on the high seas to bear
So back to the presentation. So next, we're gonna look at Sasha Banks' America Mine. And I love the cover of the book because it shows a ghost basically walking through the streets. And when we think of Erasure and Contrapuntal poems, it's thinking about who haunts spaces, who's not being represented, and in ways they can show up through this idea of haunting, basically. So, of her book, Banks said, she wanted to contradict the notion that America as an institution is untouchable. I wanted to vandalize what we know as America as this big, untouchable, great thing that was founded on all of these noble principles, and to call that down. And we're going to be looking at her poem. And she said about the poem, the layout of this poem reflects the relationship between patriotism and violence, two interconnected sides of life in America, she said. I wanted to, in this poem, talk about the relationship because I think it's inherent. It's something you're born into when you're born in this country and you're a person of color. So let's take a look at her poem, God Bless America. First, I'm gonna switch to it. Okay. So this is a contrapuntal piece by Sasha Banks, and I will read each side. God bless America, land that I love. Me as I stand beside her and let me guide her between us. All through the night, I, the darker sister with a light teeth dangling like stars from above. Bones break is heard from the mountains to the prairies to the oceans, white with foam. Sunk, I pray God bless one name like America. Beauty, this my call, no home sweet home. This bitter and slender necked stepsister that I fear will kill me in my sleep, or lynch braid the blonde ropes of her hair, will not cross the canyon she has stretched. My screams float above her like steam, too dim behind the eyes, still smile with while her heel is thrust in my face. My in Georgia and in Texas, she feeds me limb by limb back to the wet mouth of the Atlantic, despite the spilt blood below, sinking till my remembered body be made whole in the sister who denied me and kept her fickle family of bruised, blooded brothers. I will relative, no sibling, no flesh of mine. Yes. So in God Bless America, obviously Sasha is referring to the song of the same name. And she, in a sense, does a kind of contrapuntal / erasure poem in which she's taking aspects of God Bless America and rewriting it with her own words to show the history that has actually, the violence of the history that has been erased. And through this poem, she's in a sense using history to force us to see the real America and get a much better picture of America than we're actually taught. And speaking of un-American, I wanted to show a few poems from Sasha Banks in which she titles them Un-America. So here are a few poems that are on Poor Claudia, and they're American poems, but she's respelling America in a different way, and she's talking about this speculative apocalypse, which you could say that we're experiencing right now, an apocalypse of what is America. And so she wrote a series of poems of this unmaking of America. So I'll read a few of them. So America, pre-collapse 1. A blonde braid is unraveling. A glass of milk is spilt. A blue eye is gouged. An alphabet is cursed. A border is crumbling. A nose is broken. A backbone is curving. A red line is smudged. A dollar is ripping. A badge is rusted. A train track is rotting. A gate is leaning. So you see the kind of dystopia in the word she uses here. Here's America Collapse 2. I saw a city crumbling into the mouth of a many-headed beast. The beast was not the terror. She was my cousin. The terror was the sudden knowing that all empires are made out of paper and damned religions. I will tell you the horror, and that is the crumbling city's silence. Yes, its people had mouths, and yes, they were stuffed with broke-off limbs of the conquered, refusing their shouting breath. Elbow, elbow, fibula, knee, the innocuous become the silencer. The way the small do become the mighty, with new big bodies and opposable tongues. Everything does weep, but oh, how it growls when the wailing is done. If anger on the other side of fear is rage, this city was delivered to death with savage conviction. I saw the beast lick the sinew from her jaws, and the city, it was still and clean, new and clean, bright and clean as the blood on my face. And I really love this poem because Sasha explores the idea of the monstrous and the monstrosity. And I love etymology. And so if you look up the monster, it's a sign or a showing. And that oftentimes we look at the monster, right? We look at the current president as a monster and not realizing that the monster is a symptom, is birthed from the failure of the system. And so here she talks about the failure of the city and the failure of the system and how easily all things can fall apart and then the monstrosity shows up. So if you'd like to read the rest, you can go to Port Claudia and read the other, I believe, 3 poems that are there. Yeah. To the presentation. He read, God bless. Now I'm gonna leave you with a prompt that you can take away and do on your own. It's called Refounding Text. I want you to find at least one historical document and research the history behind it. Then do an erasure or contrapuntal poem that highlights the hidden history or contradictions of the text in relation to the truth of history or society. And extra credit, try creating a combined erasure or contrapuntal poem with at least 2 documents. So I will give you a moment to either write down or take a picture of the prompt. And if you have any questions or reactions, comments, you can put them in the chat. Okay. So thank you all for coming to the second workshop of Teks. This workshop series is in conjunction with my Jam Journal submissions call. Jam Journal is a new literary journal that I'm working on that invites innovative and experimental text-based works. So that can include poetry, flash fiction, or essays that are under 2 pages, text art, sound art, and videos. And you can send submissions to my email, CheriseFrancis1@gmail.com. The deadline is August 15th, 2020. And if you would like to find out more information about Jam Journal and my mobile library project, it's under J Expressions. can follow my newsletter, tinyletter.com/jexpressions, or you can follow me on Twitter at jexpressbooks or Instagram at jexpressionsbookshop. I'm also accepting donations via PayPal or Venmo or Cash App as well for the production of Jam Journal and for the mobile library at J Expressions. Thank you so much for coming to this workshop, and I hope you have a pleasant evening. Bye.